There are families in history who loved their daughters, or so they told themselves, so completely that they built walls around them. Not walls of stone, walls of silence, walls of money. Rules so quietly enforced that by the time a young woman understood she was trapped, she had already forgotten what freedom looked like. Tonight we sit with those daughters, move slowly through the rooms they were never allowed to leave. There is no rush here, only the quiet and the story and the long, soft dark. The house is still before dawn. Somewhere deep inside it, a clock ticks, not loudly, just steadily, the way old clocks do in old houses, marking time the way a heartbeat marks life, not noticed until it stops. The curtains are heavy, velvet perhaps, or brocade, the kind of fabric chosen not for beauty but for weight, for the way it holds the light out and the silence in. A thin line of grey appears at the edge of the window where the cloth does not quite meet the wall. Morning is coming, it always does. But inside this house, morning arrives differently than it does elsewhere. It does not bring birdsong or the smell of bread or the sound of children. It brings only a slow brightening of the same rooms, the same chairs, the same portraits on the walls with their steady painted eyes. This is a house that has kept its daughters. Not by force, not precisely. There are no chains here, no locks on the bedroom doors, no guards posted in the hallways. The mechanisms of confinement in these houses were always subtler than that. They were woven into the wallpaper, stitched into the hems of dresses, spoken in the measured tones of fathers who called control by other names: protection, propriety, love. Across Europe and America, across 2 centuries and dozens of families, the story repeated itself in variations so consistent they might have been rehearsed. A wealthy father. A fortune that needed protecting. Daughters who were the most elegant, most reliable, most controllable form of security a man could possess. And so the daughters stayed. They stayed in the houses, in the rooms, in the roles assigned to them before they were old enough to imagine alternatives. Some of them never tried to leave. Some of them tried and failed. A very few succeeded, carrying the weight of their escape with them for the rest of their lives, knowing what it had cost, what they had left behind, what they had been forced to become in order to survive. Tonight we move through their world slowly. Room by room, story by story, we will not rush. There is nothing here that requires urgency, only attention, only the quiet willingness to sit beside women who were never given enough of either. The clock ticks on. The curtains hold the darkness in a little longer. Somewhere in the house a woman is already awake, already moving through the rituals of another contained day. She does not know we are here. She would not mind if she did. She has learned, over many years, to keep her own company. If you find comfort in stories like this one, please consider subscribing. I post new sleep stories every week, and there is always something waiting for you here. To understand what it meant to be locked away in a wealthy house, you first have to understand the house itself. These were not ordinary buildings. The mansions and townhouses and country estates that held aristocratic and upper-class daughters across the 19th and early 20th centuries were designed, consciously or not, to make confinement feel like privilege. Every room was a demonstration of status. Every corridor communicated hierarchy. The very proportions of the ceilings, tall enough to dwarf a person standing beneath them, reminded everyone inside of their place within a larger order. The entrance hall came first. Wide, formal, floored in marble or polished stone, it was the face the house presented to the world. Visitors were received here before being judged worthy of the interior. The daughters of the house passed through this space daily, but they rarely lingered. It was a transitional room, a threshold, and thresholds reminded you that the world beyond the door existed, that it was possible in theory to cross them. Beyond the entrance hall, the house divided itself according to function and gender. The ground floor rooms, the morning room, the drawing room, the dining room belonged to the family's social performance. They were the rooms in which wealth was displayed and connections were maintained, and the family's position in society was confirmed through the careful choreography of visits and meals and evenings at home. The daughters were permitted in these rooms during prescribed hours, dressed in prescribed ways, speaking in prescribed registers. The library, when a family possessed one, was a complicated space. Books were simultaneously a mark of culture and a source of danger, since the wrong books led to the wrong ideas, and the wrong ideas led to restlessness. and restlessness was the one quality that wealthy fathers feared most in their confined daughters. Libraries in these houses tended toward the decorative. Leather-bound volumes arranged by height or colour rather than subject. Encyclopedias purchased in sets and never opened. The occasional novel considered safe, meaning dull, meaning unlikely to suggest to a young woman that there were other ways to live. The upper floors were more intimate and therefore more closely guarded. Bedrooms were private in name, but not always in practice. Mothers and household managers moved through them freely. Ladies' maids had access at all hours. The fiction of privacy was maintained, but everyone understood that the rooms were not truly a daughter's own. They were spaces on loan, subject to inspection, subject to the household's larger requirements. The servants' quarters existed in a separate geography entirely. Back staircases, narrow corridors, attic rooms with low ceilings and small windows. The daughters of wealthy houses were not supposed to know these spaces well, though some of them did, drawn by loneliness or curiosity to the only people in the building who moved through it freely, who came and went as the work required, who were not, in the most fundamental sense, contained. The garden, when the house had one, occupied a particular place in the imagination of confined women. It was the closest thing to freedom the house offered, while still remaining firmly within the household's boundaries. Walled gardens were common in England, less so in America, but the principle was the same everywhere. Nature, yes. Air and light and the smell of growing things, yes. But bounded, enclosed, still, always, within the walls. And then there was the room that existed in every one of these houses, though it was never named as such. The waiting room, not a physical space precisely, but a psychological one. Every room in the house was, for the daughters who inhabited it, a room in which they waited. For breakfast, for callers, for the afternoon's permitted walk, for the dinner hour, for the day to end, for their lives to begin. Waiting is its own kind of architecture. It has structure and rhythm and weight. It shapes the people who inhabit it as surely as any physical space does. The daughters of wealthy houses became, over years of careful waiting, expert at the small economies of confined time, embroidery that could be set down and resumed without losing the thread, music that filled the hours with something that resembled purpose, correspondence that maintained the form of connection without requiring its substance. In houses like the Wendell Mansion on Fifth Avenue, where John Wendell's 6 daughters lived their entire adult lives behind drawn curtains and locked doors, the architecture of confinement became so total that the rooms eventually ceased to function as rooms at all. They became something closer to geological formations, the accumulated sediment of years spent in the same spaces, thinking the same thoughts, following the same pathways between the same walls. When Ella Wendell died in 1931, the police who entered the mansion found newspapers stacked floor to ceiling, pathways through towers of newsprint, rooms so full of accumulated material that the original architecture was barely visible. The house had been transformed by decades of anxious retention, by the inability to release anything, into a physical map of a mind that had lost its boundaries between safety and suffocation. But the Wendells were only the most extreme case. Across the Atlantic, in the manor houses of England and the chateaux of France and the villas of northern Italy, other families had built other varieties of the same confinement, more refined in their methods, more elegant in their justifications, but functionally identical in their effect. The architecture was always the same: thick walls, heavy curtains, rooms designed to demonstrate wealth while concealing poverty, the poverty of freedom, the poverty of choice, the poverty of lives lived in preparation for something that never arrived. The clock in the entrance hall measures it all, each tick a day in the same room, each tock a year at the same window. The house remembers everything, the house keeps everything. The daughters learned in time to be grateful for walls that never moved. Gratitude in a sufficiently small room is the last thing to survive. The men who built these fortunes were, in most cases, men of genuine ability. They were intelligent, disciplined, willing to endure discomfort that others refused. They saw patterns in markets and land and industry that less attentive men missed. They made decisions with speed and confidence when others hesitated. They accumulated. John Wendell arrived in New York from Germany in 1838 with a mason's tools and a particular quality of attention, the kind that sees not what a thing is but what it might become. He looked at lower Manhattan's muddy corner lots and saw, not dirt, but futures. He bought the first parcel for $800, mortgaged to the limit of what he could borrow, and then he waited. The waiting was not passive. It was the most active thing he did. Waiting while others panicked and sold. Waiting while the city grew northward, block by block, year by year, consuming farmland and transforming it into commerce. Waiting while the value of the dirt beneath his feet multiplied without any effort on his part beyond the original decision to hold. He was not unusual in this. The great fortunes of 19th century America were built on the same principle, again and again. Buy when others sell, hold when others spend. Accumulate without sentiment, without attachment, without the softness that turned ordinary men into victims of their own desires. What made Wendell different was what the accumulation did to him. Most men who build great fortunes find, somewhere along the way, that the fortune has become large enough to change the character of the risks they take. Early risks are existential, the bet of everything on a single outcome, the willingness to lose it all. But once the fortune reaches a certain size, the risks shift in character. The man who once risked everything to gain something now risks something to avoid losing everything. The psychological orientation reverses. Fear replaces ambition as the primary engine. This reversal happened to Wendell earlier and more completely than it happened to most. By the time his son John Jr. died of tuberculosis at 16, leaving no male heir, the fortune had already become less a source of power than a source of anxiety. 6 daughters, and no son to carry the name and the estate forward. 6 daughters, and a world full of men who would, Wendell was certain, attempt to access the fortune through marriage, through legal maneuver, through the slow, patient seduction of women who had been raised in too much comfort to recognize danger. His response was to make the fortress of his family impenetrable. He did not do this through cruelty, or not primarily through cruelty. He did it through the steady daily application of a logic that was, within its own terms, consistent. Every suitor was a threat. Every social engagement was an opportunity for someone to penetrate the family's defenses. Every dollar spent outside the household was a dollar that might not return. Every door left open was an invitation to those who wanted what the family had. The daughters were not, in Wendell's understanding, being deprived of their lives. They were being protected. The world, he was certain, was hostile. The evidence for this was everywhere. The tenement tenants who paid their rent late, who complained about conditions, who occasionally defaulted entirely. The business associates who smiled while calculating their advantage. The lawyers and bankers who skim their percentages from every transaction. The marriage market, most corrosive of all, where a man with nothing might attach himself to a woman with everything and call it love. Wendell had come from nothing. He understood the hunger of men with nothing. He would not allow that hunger access to what he had built. The daughters understood this logic. They had grown up inside it. It was the water they swam in, the air they breathed. Their father's fear was not presented to them as fear. It was presented as wisdom, as experience, as the inevitable conclusion drawn by a man who had seen the world clearly and knew what it contained. What it contained, as he explained to Mary after intercepting Thomas Fanning's letter, was men who wanted access to money they had not earned. What it contained was risk. What it contained, always, was the possibility of loss. And so the daughters learned to see through their father's eyes. They learned to read every approach as an approach toward the fortune rather than toward themselves. They learned that the self and the fortune were, in this family, so thoroughly merged that there was no meaningful distinction between protecting one and protecting the other. They were the fortune. The fortune was them. This was the inheritance that shaped everything that followed. Not the money, not the properties, not the ledgers and deeds and rent rolls, but the psychological architecture that John Wendell built inside his daughters. The conviction that the world was hostile, that trust was weakness, that the only safety lay in walls, in locks, in the refusal of everything that came from outside. He lived to 81, which meant he had 40 years to install this architecture deeply enough that no later experience could dislodge it. By the time he died, his daughters did not need him to enforce the rules. They enforced the rules themselves. They became their own jailers, their own guards, their own most faithful disciples. The fortune passed to them intact. The fear passed to them intact. And in the end, the fear outlasted the fortune by decades, shaping their lives long after there was any rational basis for it, long after the threats their father had warned them about had transformed into something far more dangerous. The sisters' own isolation, their own accumulated distrust, their own inability to distinguish between a world that wanted to take from them and a world that simply wanted to know them. Other wealthy fathers in other wealthy houses had made similar calculations. The names were different, the countries were different. The specific mechanisms of control varied with the customs of each culture, but the logic was everywhere the same. Fortune plus fear plus daughters equals confinement. Confinement, pursued long enough, becomes its own kind of inheritance. An inheritance, when it is never examined, is just another word for a cage that feels like home. The story of wealthy fathers and confined daughters was not unique to America, nor was it unique to the particular obsessions of men like John Wendell. Across England, across the long arc of the 19th century, the same pattern repeated itself in drawing rooms and country houses and London townhouses, dressed in the language of propriety and refinement, but identical in its essential logic. The English version was, if anything, more systematic than the American one. It had centuries of tradition behind it, a legal framework, a social infrastructure, an entire vocabulary of justification. The heiress who was too valuable to risk on an unsuitable marriage. The daughter of good family who required protection from fortune hunters. The young woman whose future was too important to be left to her own judgment. The language was always about the woman's benefit. The practice was always about the family's interest. Consider the Curzon family, whose story was not unusual enough to merit much historical attention, which is precisely why it merits attention here. The Curzons were a Derbyshire family of solid middle gentry stock, not spectacularly wealthy, but possessed of land and a comfortable income, and an acute sensitivity to the dangers of marrying below their station. The eldest daughter, Eleanor, born in 1847, was by all accounts a young woman of intelligence and warmth. She had received the standard education of her class, French and watercolours, and enough piano to perform adequately at family evenings. She had opinions about literature, and a particular fondness for gardening that her mother considered slightly unfeminine, but tolerated as a harmless eccentricity. Eleanor was 22 when the family's financial circumstances shifted unexpectedly. Her father inherited a substantial sum from a bachelor uncle, enough to elevate the Curzons from comfortable gentry to genuine wealth. The inheritance changed nothing about their daily life and everything about how they understood their position. Money at that level, new money, sudden money, creates a particular kind of anxiety in families accustomed to the moderate security of older, smaller fortunes. Eleanor's father, William Curzon, responded to the inheritance the way many men in his position did. He became protective of it to the point of immobility. The question of Eleanor's marriage, which had previously been approached with the ordinary mixture of hope and practicality common to families of her class, became suddenly freighted with an entirely new set of calculations. The estate now had something worth protecting. The daughter was now a vehicle through which that protection could be either maintained or compromised. Every suitor had to be evaluated not merely as a prospective husband, but as a potential threat to the inheritance that William Curzon had spent very little time earning but a great deal of time worrying about. The standard by which suitors were measured was, of course, impossible to meet. A man with less money than the Curzons was a fortune hunter. A man with equivalent money was acceptable in theory but lacking in sufficient distinction. A man with more money was suspicious, since what could motivate such a man to seek Eleanor's hand except some hidden deficiency that the family had not yet identified? Eleanor was 28 before the pattern became apparent to her. She had been introduced to perhaps a dozen young men over the previous 6 years, each meeting carefully controlled, each evening chaperoned to the point of meaninglessness. She had never had a real conversation with any of them, not one that moved past the prescribed topics of weather and country pursuits and the social calendar. She had never been alone with any of them for longer than it took to walk from one end of a drawing room to another. She was, she realised at 28, in the process of becoming someone who would never marry. Not because she was undesirable, not because she lacked opportunity, but because the conditions under which opportunity was offered made connection impossible. She wrote about this realisation in her diary, which survived and was discovered among family papers in the 1970s. The entry is careful, measured, written in the controlled hand of a woman who had learned to modulate even her private expression. She noted that she'd begun to wonder whether her father's concern for the estate was in fact a concern for her at all, or whether it had simply taken her shape in his imagination, the way a river takes the shape of its banks, filling whatever space it finds. The entry ends with a line that has been quoted by historians studying the period. She wrote that she had decided to stop wandering, as wandering was a luxury that her situation did not permit. Eleanor Curzon never married. She lived in the family house until her father died, then until her mother died, then until her younger brother, who had inherited the estate, died of a fever in 1901. The estate passed to a distant cousin. Eleanor was given a modest income and a grace and favour arrangement in a smaller house on the estate grounds. She lived there until 1919, when she died quietly at the age of 72. Her diary, which she kept until the year before her death, records a life of genuine texture and quiet attention. She became an expert gardener. She read widely and thought carefully. She maintained friendships through letters. She was not, in the conventional understanding, unhappy. She had found, as many confined women had found before her, the art of making a life within the available dimensions. But the diary also records, with the same careful restraint, the moments when the available dimensions felt insufficient. A spring morning when she watched a young couple walking together in the lane beyond the garden wall, and felt something she described only as the recognition of a thing she would not have. A letter from a school friend who had married and moved to India and written of heat and colour and strangeness, and a life unrecognisable from anything Eleanor had known. The entry following that letter is the shortest in the diary. It contains only 5 words. She sounds very far away. The distance was not geographical. The English pattern was in most cases less extreme than the American one. English families rarely descended to the Wendell degree of physical isolation and psychological disintegration. The social structure was too robust, the expectations of gentility too firmly maintained, for most families to allow their houses to become the kind of monuments to paranoia that the Wendell mansion became. But the underlying mechanism was identical. Women were assets. Assets required protection. Protection required control. And control, when it extended across decades and encompassed the whole of a woman's social, emotional and intellectual life, was indistinguishable from imprisonment, no matter how fine the curtains or how well-tuned the piano. The drawing room in these English houses was always warm. The fire was always laid. The tea was always on time, and the daughters sat within it, year after year, arranged like the furniture, decorative and precisely placed, adding comfort to the room without ever being permitted to leave it. There is a particular kind of document that historians of confined women return to again and again, not because it is reliable, not because it tells the complete story, but because it tells the true one, the unsent letter. They turn up in diaries and between the pages of books and folded inside the linings of boxes that were never meant to be opened. Letters addressed to suitors who were turned away before a real conversation could begin. Letters addressed to sisters or friends or imagined correspondents who stood in for the world that the writer could not reach. Letters addressed to no one, which is to say, letters addressed to the self, to the version of the self that existed in some parallel life where the choices had been different. These letters survive because their writers could not send them and could not destroy them. Sending was impossible, for reasons that varied from family to family, but always came back to the same source: the father, the brother, the household authority whose permission governed every piece of paper that left the house. Destroying was impossible for a different reason. You cannot burn the truest version of yourself. You can fold it and hide it and never speak of it, but you cannot unmake it. A woman named Clara Hawthorne, daughter of a Bristol merchant who had made a considerable fortune in the wool trade and thereafter devoted his energies to protecting it, wrote the following in a letter that was found inside a Bible after her death in 1889. She was 46 years old when she died. She had never married. The letter begins in the middle of a thought, as if she had been turning it over in her mind for some time before committing it to paper. She writes about a morning she had watched her father refuse a visitor at the door, a young man who had called twice before and who Clara knew, from brief conversations conducted in the narrow window between propriety and her father's attention, to be sincere in his interest. She had watched from the landing above the entrance hall, invisible, as her father spoke to this young man in measured tones that communicated, without ever raising to the level of hostility, that he was unwelcome and would remain unwelcome. She had watched the young man turn and walk back down the path to the street. She writes that she'd been holding the banister so tightly that her hand ached afterward. She writes that she'd gone back to her room and sat at her writing table for a long time, not writing, just sitting. She writes that she had thought about calling out to him, that she had thought about it for days afterward, imagining the sound her voice would have made in the air of the entrance hall, imagining the young man turning back, imagining her father's face. She did not call out. She sat at her writing table in silence, as she had sat before, as she would sit again, counting the distance between what was possible and what was permitted. The letter ends without any formal closing. It simply stops, mid-thought, as if she had run out of either words or courage, and set the pen down and folded the paper away. Clara Hawthorne's story is not exceptional. The exceptional quality lies only in the survival of the letter. For every document that endured, 100 were destroyed, either by the writers themselves or by families, anxious to present a dignified account of lives that had not, in truth, been particularly dignified. But the letters that survive tell a consistent story, not of despair necessarily, though despair is present in some of them, not of bitterness, though bitterness appears too, always carefully modulated, always gentled into something more socially acceptable. The consistent note in these letters is something quieter and in some ways more unsettling than either despair or bitterness. It is the note of observation, of women who had been given nothing to do but watch, who had consequently developed an almost clinical precision in their recording of what they saw, women who had learned to describe the texture of their confinement with the same fine attention that a naturalist brings to the description of a specimen, not because they lacked feeling, but because feeling without outlet becomes, in time, a form of seeing. One correspondent, writing in the 1890s to a friend who had managed to marry and move to Edinburgh, describes her daily routine with a specificity that reads, at first, like contentment. The morning walk in the garden, the hour with her mother in the sitting room, the afternoon letters, the calls that sometimes came and the more frequent afternoons when no calls came and the hours had to be filled with needlework or reading, or the management of small household tasks that did not, strictly speaking, require her involvement but provided something to do. Then, near the end of the letter, almost as an afterthought, she writes, I have been thinking that I have been describing the same morning for 15 years, and that if I were to go back and read every letter I've sent you, I would find nothing in them that could distinguish one year from another, except perhaps the weather, which at least has the consideration to change. The friend's reply to that letter does not survive. We know the letter existed because the writer refers to it in a subsequent note, thanking her friend for her understanding and saying only that she had not meant to cause worry, that she was quite well, that the garden was coming along beautifully this spring. The unsent letters are the more honest archive. In them, the observation sharpens into something closer to statement. Women who could not say what they needed to say to the people who were making their lives small said it instead to paper, to imaginary recipients, to the future, which is, in the end, what all letters are addressed to. You're reading them now. They were always meant for you. The bodies of confined women tell their own kind of story, not the dramatic stories of illness or sudden death, though those are present too, but the quieter story of what happens to a body when its movements are restricted, its freedoms curtailed, its purposes redefined as decorative rather than functional. In the wealthy houses of the 19th century, the physical management of women's bodies was a science, or at least a practice with the confidence of a science. Corsets that restructured the torso in compliance with an aesthetic ideal that had no basis in physiology and considerable basis in the desire to render women structurally dependent on the garments that contained them. Shoes that were beautiful and impractical and made the kind of walking that covers real distance into a performance of fragility. Hairstyles that required extensive preparation and maintenance and served as a daily reminder of the body's status as an object of display. The daughters of wealthy houses spent considerable portions of their mornings being physically prepared for the day's confinement. Ladies' maids moved through the bedroom routines with practiced efficiency. The corset laced, the hair arranged, the dress fitted. The result was a woman who was physically contained before she had left the bedroom, whose very body was already shaped by the requirements of the household's presentation to the world. Movement within the house was governed by propriety, which meant that certain gaits, certain gestures, certain ways of holding the body were appropriate and others were not. A young woman of good family did not run. She did not shout across rooms. She did not sit with the ease of someone who owned the space she occupied, even if, technically, she did own it. She moved with deliberation, with control, with the constant awareness of being observed and evaluated. The permitted exercise was minimal by modern standards: a walk in the garden, weather permitting, a carriage ride if the family possessed a carriage and the father permitted it, croquet or lawn tennis in the latter part of the century, when such activities became fashionable enough to overcome the objection that physical exertion was unladylike. But the walk was within the garden walls, the carriage ride was chaperoned, the tennis was played on the family's own ground. The body was never, in any of these arrangements, truly free. What this meant in practice over years and decades was a physical narrowing that paralleled the psychological one. Women who had spent their childhoods in the relatively unrestricted movement that even restricted Victorian childhood allowed, who had run in gardens and climbed trees and moved through space with the freedom of bodies that had not yet been fully claimed by propriety, found as they entered adulthood that the world of permitted movement contracted steadily around them. At 12, the garden was hers. At 16, the garden and the street with a companion. At 20, the street only on formal occasions and always with escort. At 30, the house, the garden, the carriage, the church on Sundays. At 40, mostly the house, the body and the house growing into each other over the years until the distinction between them became theoretical. The Wendell sisters are again the most extreme illustration of this process, though it is worth emphasizing, as it always is with the Wendells, that extremity clarifies without distorting. Their story is not an anomaly, it is an amplification. By the final years of their lives, Ella and Georgiana rarely left the ground floor. The stairs had become too difficult. The upper stories, once their bedrooms, were abandoned to decay and newspaper towers and hidden money. Their world had contracted to a few rooms, then to the particular chairs they slept in, then to the radius of movement those chairs permitted. Their bodies, by the time of their deaths, showed the consequences of decades of minimal movement, inadequate nutrition, and near-total isolation. Ella, when the police found her in March of 1931, was skeletal. Her skin was marked with sores from sitting too long in one position. Her hands were scarred from cuts she had not properly treated. She had lost most of her teeth. She weighed, according to the coroner's report, considerably less than the average woman half her age. This was the terminal consequence of a process that had begun, not in the final years of isolation, but in childhood. Not with the abandonment of the upper floors, but with the first permission withheld, the first suitor turned away, the first morning that began the same as the morning before it, and ended the same, and offered, somewhere in the middle, the same vista of the same walls. The body does not forget what it has not been allowed to do. It carries the memory of restriction, in its posture, in its gait, in the particular quality of stillness that develops in people who have learned to take up as little space as possible. In the houses where daughters were kept, the bodies of those daughters became, over time, the most precise record of what the keeping had cost. The corset stays in the drawer, unused now, rusting a little in the damp of a house that is no longer properly heated. The shoes are still by the door, the hairbrushes are still on the dressing table, and somewhere in the house, a woman is sitting very still, taking up very little space, waiting for something that may or may not be coming. Her body has learned by now to wait without hoping. That is the body's most efficient adaptation. It costs the least, and saves the most, and tells you nothing about what it has already spent. The fortune hunter was the great villain of the Victorian and Edwardian imagination, and like most great villains, he was partly real and partly construction, a figure onto whom genuine fears and social anxieties were projected until he became something more than any individual man could actually be. He existed, certainly. The historical record is full of men who married women for access to their family's money, who spent inheritance with the efficient purposefulness of people who understood, on some level, that the money was not theirs, and therefore need not be treated as if it were. The wreckage of these marriages was real and documented and frequently devastating, not only financially but in every other dimension of the women's lives. The cases that became famous, that were reported in the papers and discussed in drawing rooms and used as cautionary illustrations in the education of daughters, were the cases in which the fortune was conspicuously destroyed. The Irish peer who married a manufacturing heiress in 1870 and spent her inheritance on horses and gambling debts, and a second household that everyone except the wife knew about. The American who wooed an English landowner's daughter across 2 seasons of careful charm and then, once the settlements were signed, revealed a character so comprehensively different from the one he had presented that his wife's family spent the next decade trying to find legal grounds to undo what the wedding ceremony had done. These stories were real. The men in them were real. The damage they caused was real. But the fathers who used these stories to justify confining their daughters were not, in most cases, simply protecting their children from a known and specific danger. They were protecting their fortunes from a generalized ambient threat that they had chosen to personify in the figure of the fortune hunter, because giving fear a face makes it easier to manage. The fortune hunter was useful precisely because he could be made to appear anywhere. Every suitor was potentially a fortune hunter. Every expression of interest was potentially calculated. Every kind word, every dinner invitation, every letter politely requesting permission to call could be read by a father already inclined to read it that way, as the opening move in a strategy of acquisition. John Wendell saw Thomas Fanning's letter to his daughter Mary and read it as exactly this kind of strategy. A clerk earning $1,200 a year, writing to the daughter of a family worth $20 million. What else could it be? What else could it be? The question, posed as a rhetorical device to silence Mary's objection, was actually a genuine question with genuine possible answers. It could have been a young man who had noticed a young woman at church and found himself drawn to her in the way that people are drawn to people they find compelling. It could have been an approach made in genuine ignorance of the family's wealth, or made in spite of knowledge of it, by someone who found that a woman he respected was more important to him than the financial disparity between their families. These things happened. They were not statistical anomalies. People married across financial differences and across class differences, and the marriages were sometimes disastrous and sometimes ordinary and sometimes quietly and without drama genuinely good. But Wendell had constructed a frame within which none of these possibilities could be seen. His frame had room for only two figures, the fortune and its guardian. Everything outside the frame was threat. Every person outside the family was, in the absence of proof of innocence, guilty of wanting what the family had. Within this frame, the daughters were not women capable of judgment. They were assets requiring protection, valuable precisely because of their connection to the fortune, vulnerable precisely for the same reason. Their desire for connection, their capacity for love, their ability to read another person's character and intentions, all of this was, within Wendell's frame, irrelevant. Worse than irrelevant. It was a liability, because desire made them susceptible to manipulation, because love made them stupid, because the capacity to trust was, in the logic of a man who trusted no one, a fundamental weakness. He was not wrong about everything. The world did contain people who would exploit access to wealth. The history of marriages made for money rather than affection is long and genuinely unhappy. His daughters were genuinely vulnerable, in the sense that any young woman in 19th century America was vulnerable to the legal and social structures that gave husbands significant control over the property their wives brought to a marriage. But the frame was not wrong in the way that a factual error is wrong. It was wrong in the way that a map drawn to serve a particular purpose is wrong. It accurately described some of the terrain while systematically omitting other parts. It told you where the dangers were without telling you where the roads were. It identified every stranger as a threat without providing any means of distinguishing the threatening from the harmless, the fortune hunter from the person who simply wanted to know your daughter. The fathers who confined their daughters were, in most cases, not consciously malicious. They had simply, over years of accumulated fear, refined their maps to the point where they could no longer read the territory. They had mistaken the map for reality and built their daughters' lives around it. And the daughters, raised inside the map, grew up not knowing that a different cartography existed. They learned to read danger in the same places their fathers had, marked it. They learned to see approach as threat, interest as calculation, affection as strategy. They learned to hold the world at a distance that kept them safe and kept them alone. The fortune hunters were real. The daughters were also real. The tragedy is not that the fathers got the balance wrong. The tragedy is that the fathers drew the map and the daughters had to live inside it, and maps, once you have navigated by them long enough, reshape the landscape of the mind until you cannot imagine moving without them. There is a particular image that recurs in the accounts left by and about confined women across this period. The woman at the window, it appears in diaries, it appears in the letters of concerned relatives. It appears in the handful of contemporary accounts that describe encounters with women living in the kind of isolation the Wendell sisters eventually reached. It appears in the paintings of the period, a figure silhouetted against the light, looking out at something the viewer cannot see. The window in these accounts is never simply a window. It is the exact thickness of the distance between the life being lived and the life being imagined. It offers light and visibility and the sensation of proximity to the moving world without providing access to any of it. You can see the street from the window, you can watch the people passing, you can observe, in the particular way that a person who cannot participate learns to observe, the texture of a world that has been made unavailable to you. Some confined women became remarkable observers. The window gave them a vantage point that was, in certain respects, more complete than the vantage point available to people who moved through the world rather than watching it. They saw patterns that participants missed. They noticed the social choreography of street life, the negotiations and signals and small transactions of a community going about its business. They saw the city as a system rather than an experience, which gave their accounts of it a quality of precision that the records of more mobile women sometimes lack. But observation is not participation. The clarity of the view from the window comes at the cost of everything that cannot be seen from a fixed point. The smell of the street in summer, the weight of a crowd pressing around you, the particular sensation of moving through a city without knowing exactly where you are going, following your own direction in your own time. The Wendell sisters took carriage rides through Central Park in their youth. Their father permitted them on weekdays, when the paths were less crowded, under his supervision or the supervision of a trusted servant. They moved through the park in the enclosed space of the carriage, watching the trees and the paths and the occasional figure passing, from behind glass, always from behind glass. Ella Wendell, in the final years of her life, watched the 20th century transform the street outside her window from something she recognized into something she had no frame for. The automobiles that replaced the carriages, the buildings that rose and changed the light, the fashions that shifted until the women passing below her window looked to her eyes barely like women at all. Skirts that ended at the knee, hair cut short, women walking alone, walking fast, walking with the directional confidence of people who had somewhere specific to be. She watched all of this from the window of a house where nothing changed. The world that the Wendell sisters missed was not only the world of suitors and marriages and the social life their father withheld from them, it was also the world of the suffrage movement, which gathered strength through the 1890s and achieved its first significant American victories in the early 1900s, and finally, in 1920, produced the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote in federal elections. The Wendell sisters were alive when this happened. They were in the house on Fifth Avenue, in their 60s and 70s, surrounded by newspapers they no longer read, when the right they had been denied as a matter of course for their entire lives was written into the Constitution. There is no evidence that they noticed. The newspapers piled up unread. The constitutional amendment was reported in every edition. The headlines would have been visible on the front pages stacked in the hallways if any of the sisters had thought to look. They did not look. The world outside the window had ceased to be a source of information by then. It had become only a movement of light and shadow, a reminder that time was passing, that the city was continuing without them. Outside the window of every house where daughters were kept, the world continued its business. The streets filled and emptied, the seasons turned, the century changed. The daughters of the Wendell family and of the Curzon family, and of 100 other families whose stories are less documented, watched it all from the interior of rooms that never changed. The window does not judge. It simply shows you what is there, and what is there is always, always the world without you in it. The women who lived confined lives left a particular kind of legacy. Not the legacy of accomplishment, not the legacy of property or title or named endowment, but the legacy of pattern, of the way that certain ways of being in the world reproduce themselves across generations whether or not anyone intends them to. Some confined women had no descendants. The Wendell sisters, none of them having married or borne children, left no direct line. The patterns John Wendell had installed in them died when Ella died in 1931, or so it might seem. But patterns are not only biological, they move through families in other ways. The distant relatives who inherited the Wendell fortune, and subsequently spent most of it in the space of a generation or two were, in some respects, enacting the mirror image of the sisters' pathology, where the sisters had been unable to release anything, unable to spend, unable to change. The heirs were unable to hold. The fortune that had been frozen for decades liquefied in their hands almost immediately. New houses, new cars, business ventures, investments. The money moved through them like water through cupped palms. This is not a moral judgment. People who inherit sudden wealth after ordinary lives frequently struggle to manage it. The psychology of sudden fortune is its own study, distinct from the psychology of accumulated fortune or of inherited wealth received as part of a lifelong expectation. The Wendell heirs were ordinary people handed an extraordinary sum in extraordinary circumstances, and their subsequent behaviour was, statistically, fairly ordinary. But there is something in the pattern worth noting. The sisters held too tight. The heirs released too fast. The fortune that had been the organising principle of 6 lives for 60 years was gone within a generation, as if it had been held under pressure for so long that when the pressure released it simply dispersed. The families who confined their daughters and succeeded in the sense of maintaining the fortune across generations tended to be the families who found a way to release enough pressure to prevent the kind of catastrophic collapse the Wendells experienced. This usually meant allowing at least some of the daughters to marry, carefully, into families whose wealth and social position were deemed secure enough to warrant the risk. The fortune was passed through marriage rather than despite it. The daughters were used as instruments of alliance rather than simply as guards. This was its own form of confinement, arguably a more sophisticated one, since it maintained the fiction of freedom while serving the same purpose. A woman who was permitted to marry, but permitted to marry only within a narrow band of acceptable options, was not, in any meaningful sense, free to choose. She was managed more elegantly than her Wendell counterparts. The cage was larger and better furnished, and the door was not locked, but simply opened onto a smaller adjacent cage. The daughters of these managed marriages often reproduced the management in their own households, doing to their own daughters what had been done to them, not out of calculated cruelty but out of the inherited conviction that this was what love looked like, that protection and control were synonyms, that keeping a daughter safe meant keeping her contained. The legacy of confined women is, in this sense, not only a historical artifact, it is a living inheritance, moving through families and institutions in diluted but recognizable forms. The impulse to restrict rather than equip, to protect rather than prepare, to value safety over agency. These are not historical curiosities. They are recognizable in any family that has learned somewhere in its past that the world is primarily a source of threat. What gets passed on is not the specific mechanism of confinement. It is the underlying conviction about what the world is and what people need to survive in it. John Wendell passed this conviction to his daughters. They held it so faithfully that it consumed them. But the conviction itself, the world is hostile, trust no one, hold tight, never release, is far more portable than a fortune and far more durable than a mansion. It lives in the spaces between generations, in the warnings mothers give their daughters, in the expectations fathers communicate without words, in the particular way that families understand risk and navigate change and respond to the unknown. The women who were confined in the great houses of the 19th and early 20th centuries are gone. The houses themselves are mostly gone, or transformed into offices and apartment buildings and hotels where no one knows what the walls once held. But what was passed on to them, and what some of them then passed on in turn, is not entirely gone. It is visible if you know where to look in the families that hold too tight, in the daughters who have learned to take up very little space, in the quiet rooms where women sit very still and wait for something they have learned not to expect. The clock in those rooms measures it faithfully. Tick, another day inside the frame. Tock, another year of the same walls. The inheritance is not money. The inheritance was never money. Everything slows eventually. The day slows toward its ending. The season slows toward its turning. The story slows toward the particular stillness that comes just before the lights go down. We have moved through many rooms tonight, through the entrance halls of houses designed to impress and contain, through libraries with books arranged for appearance rather than reading, through drawing rooms where daughters sat in carefully managed light, performing the stillness required of them, through gardens enclosed by walls, through the interiors of carriages with glass between the passengers and the world, through bedrooms that were private only in name. We have sat with Eleanor Curzon in her garden in Derbyshire, watching the seasons change outside the walls while her life inside them remained the same. We have listened to Clara Hawthorne's unsent letter, her hand on the banister, the retreating figure on the path below. We have stood beside Mary Wendell at the window of the Fifth Avenue mansion, watching a man walk away from her toward a life in Boston, toward an ordinary life that she would never know. We have sat with Ella, at the end of everything, in the house that had become a repository for everything that could not be released. The newspapers of 50 years, the money hidden in cracker boxes and coat linings and the spaces between mattress and frame, the ghosts of 5 sisters moving through the rooms, their voices audible only to the one person who remained to hear them. This is the room where we rest for a moment before the story closes. It is a room like many rooms in these houses. Not the formal rooms, not the rooms designed for display, but one of the smaller ones, the ones that existed for daily life rather than performance. The morning room, perhaps, or the smaller sitting room at the back of the house, the one that catches the afternoon light. The furniture is comfortable in the way that furniture becomes comfortable over decades of use, worn into the shape of the people who have used it. The upholstery is faded but clean. The cushions hold the impression of the body that last sat in them, a slight depression, a memory in foam and fabric. On the table beside the chair a cup of tea, long cold now, no one has drunk from it. The window shows a garden, late in the day, the light going golden, the shadows lengthening across the grass. A bird moves in the hedge. A leaf falls, turning slowly, catching the light for a moment before it reaches the ground. This is what the confined women saw, many of them. This light, this garden, this particular quality of late afternoon, when the world seems to pause for a breath before moving again toward evening. Some of them found it beautiful. Some of them found it unbearable. Some of them found it both, on different days, or both on the same day, depending on where the mind happened to land in the long unstructured hours. The Wendell sisters, in their childhood before the patterns fully hardened, must have sat in rooms like this, must have watched gardens like this one, must have felt the specific pleasure of a late afternoon in autumn when the light is warm and the air is cool, and the world outside the window is proceeding at its usual pace, while inside in the sitting room everything is temporarily still. The afternoon was theirs in those early years, before the rules had calcified, before the waiting had become the whole of the day, before the rooms had filled with the accumulated weight of everything that was never released. They were daughters before they were custodians. They were young before they were old. They sat in these rooms and looked out at these gardens and were, for at least a few years, simply alive in the way that children are alive, without calculation, without the architecture of fear, without the frame that would later determine what they were permitted to see. That version of them is here too, in this last room, before the newspapers, before the hidden money, before the locked doors and the drawn curtains and the ghosts, before all of it. Just girls sitting in a room, watching the afternoon light move across the garden, not thinking about anything in particular, not guarding anything, not waiting for anything, just here, just alive, just here. The light fades slowly. The garden darkens. The bird in the hedge is quiet now. The cup of tea sits, untouched, still holding warmth in the way that ordinary things hold warmth, for longer than you expect, cooling toward the temperature of the room around them, becoming slowly indistinguishable from everything else. The clock on the mantelpiece ticks. Outside, the city is moving. It is always moving. The streets are full of people going in their own directions, at their own pace, toward their own lives. Some of them are happy, some of them are not. Most of them are somewhere in between, doing the ordinary difficult work of being alive, making choices, making mistakes, changing course, holding on to some things and releasing others. The door to this room is not locked. It was never locked in the end. Not truly. The locks were always somewhere else, in the mind, in the inherited architecture of fear, in the frame that showed only danger and never the roads. The door stands open. The garden is still there. The afternoon light is fading, but not gone. There is still time. There is always, somewhere, still a little time. We come back now to where we began. The house is quiet, the curtains hold the darkness. The clock on the mantelpiece ticks its patient measure, marking time, marking time. The daughters of these houses are gone. The houses themselves are mostly gone, or changed beyond recognition, their marble floors covered with carpet, their drawing rooms converted to conference rooms, their gardens paved over or built upon, or simply left to grow wild in the way that gardens do when no one tends them, when the people who walked in them are no longer there to keep back the wilderness. What remains is the story, the quiet truth of rooms that kept people in them, of fathers who confused protection with possession, of daughters who learned, because they had to live in the space they were given and find within it what beauty and meaning they could. They were remarkable, many of them, in their patience, in their observation, in the interior lives they sustained against the pressure of confinement. They were also human and limited and damaged in the ways that people are always damaged when the world they inhabit does not provide them with what they need. Tonight you have sat with them for a while. That is enough. That is, perhaps, what the unsent letters were always asking for. Not rescue, not intervention, not a different ending to the story. Just this. Someone to sit quietly in the same room. Someone to read the letters that were written for the future, for the someone who might one day be listening in the dark. You were always the one they were writing to. Sleep now. The house is quiet. The garden is dark. The light is gone. You are not locked in. You are here, and the door is open, and the night is soft and long. Rest. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps us keep making more. See you in the next one. If you could sit down for an afternoon with one of the women from tonight's story, what would you want to ask her? Leave your answer in the comments. I read everyone.